What happens when a city built below sea level, protected by a system of barriers that everyone knew was insufficient, is struck by a storm that forecasters had warned for decades could destroy it? The answer, when it came in the late summer of 2005, was not simply a natural disaster. It was a demonstration of how vulnerability accumulates quietly over decades, until a single event makes it impossible to ignore. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Clara.
There is a disaster that broke open not only levees and neighborhoods, but also decades of deferred questions about infrastructure, inequality, and the obligations of government to its most vulnerable citizens. Tonight, we turn to a moment in American history that revealed, with terrible clarity, how a catastrophe is rarely only a meteorological event. The question before us is how a city known around the world for its culture, its resilience, and its deep sense of place came to be submerged, and what that submersion revealed about the society that surrounded it.
The answer does not begin with the storm. It begins with the ground on which New Orleans was built, and with the decisions made over many generations about how to protect a city that should, by any strict geographical logic, not have been possible to sustain.
We are speaking about Hurricane Katrina.
Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast of the United States in late August of 2005, and caused the catastrophic flooding of New Orleans through the failure of its levee system, producing one of the deadliest and most consequential disasters in modern American history.
Then let us begin with the city itself, and with what made it so extraordinarily vulnerable.
New Orleans was founded in 1718 on a natural levee along the Mississippi River, a relatively elevated strip of land in an otherwise low-lying region of coastal Louisiana. Over the following centuries, as the city expanded, it grew into areas of lower and lower elevation, including former swampland that had been drained using pumping systems developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As the drained soil dried and compacted, much of the city sank. By 2005, significant portions of New Orleans sat between 1 and 3 meters below sea level, surrounded on multiple sides by water. The Mississippi River to the south, Lake Pontchartrain to the north, the Gulf of Mexico beyond that.
So the city was essentially a bowl, held dry only by the continuous operation of pumps and the integrity of flood barriers.
Yes, and the system of levees and flood walls that protected it had been constructed and maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers over many decades, but had never been built to withstand a major hurricane of the highest classification. This was not a secret. Studies conducted as early as the 1960s, and updated repeatedly in the decades that followed, had identified a catastrophic flood scenario as a foreseeable and likely outcome if a major storm made landfall in a direct or near-direct path toward the city. Requests for funding to upgrade the levee system to higher protection standards had been made for years. Those requests had been partially or fully denied on multiple occasions due to competing priorities in federal budget allocations.
So the catastrophe that appeared sudden to the outside world had been documented, predicted, and deferred for decades.
Yes, and this is the first major corrective to how Hurricane Katrina is sometimes understood. It is not accurately described as an unforeseeable natural disaster. It is more accurately described as a foreseeable disaster that was allowed to remain foreseeable until the moment it became real. Hurricane Katrina formed as a tropical depression in the Bahamas on the 23rd of August, 2005. It strengthened rapidly, making a first landfall in southern Florida as a relatively modest storm before moving into the Gulf of Mexico. In the Gulf, the storm encountered unusually warm water and intensified dramatically. By the 28th of August, it had reached Category 5 strength, with sustained winds exceeding 280 kilometers per hour. The National Hurricane Center issued warnings of extreme severity. Meteorologists described the approaching storm in language that left no ambiguity about the potential for mass casualties and the inundation of low-lying areas.
So the warnings were explicit, and they came before the storm made landfall.
Yes, the mayor of New Orleans issued a mandatory evacuation order on the 28th of August, the first mandatory evacuation in the city's history. Roughly 80% of the city's population left before the storm arrived, but a significant portion of the population did not or could not evacuate. These were predominantly residents who lacked access to private vehicles, who could not afford transportation, lodging, or the financial disruption of an extended absence, or who had nowhere to go. The city's evacuation plans had been built around assumptions that would prove catastrophically inadequate. They did not make sufficient provision for residents without cars, for the elderly, for those in medical facilities, or for those without the financial means to sustain themselves outside the city for an unknown period.
So the evacuation plan was designed around the resources of those who had resources, not around those who did not.
Exactly, and this structural gap would become one of the most discussed and most damning aspects of the crisis in the weeks and months that followed. The Superdome, a large indoor sports arena in central New Orleans, was designated as a shelter of last resort for those who could not leave. Tens of thousands of people gathered there in the days before the storm, with limited supplies and no clear plan for what would happen after it passed. Hurricane Katrina made its main landfall in southeastern Louisiana in the early hours of the 29th of August 2005. The storm had weakened somewhat from its peak, but still arrived as a powerful Category 3 hurricane. The initial winds and storm surge caused severe damage along the Gulf Coast, particularly in Mississippi, where entire coastal communities were swept away. But the most consequential event for New Orleans was not the storm itself. It was what happened to the levees.
So, the destruction of New Orleans was primarily a failure of engineering and infrastructure, not simply a meteorological event.
Yes, and this distinction matters enormously for how the disaster is understood. Investigations conducted after the event concluded that the levee failures were the result of design flaws, inadequate construction, insufficient funding, and poor oversight, not simply the overwhelming force of the threat. Storm is ended. The Industrial Canal Levee failed early on the morning of the 29th. The 17th Street Canal Levee failed shortly after. The London Avenue Canal Levee failed. Water poured into the city from multiple directions simultaneously. Within hours, roughly 80% of the city was underwater. In some neighborhoods, floodwater reached the rooflines of single-story homes. Residents who had remained found themselves trapped on upper floors, in attics, or on rooftops, unable to reach safety, and with no clear understanding of when or whether help would arrive.
So the flooding was not gradual. It was rapid and total in much of the city.
Yes, and the scale of it overwhelmed any response that had been prepared. Telephone infrastructure failed. Coordination between emergency agencies collapsed. The structures that were supposed to manage a disaster of this kind proved unable to function at the level the situation required. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, which bore primary responsibility for coordinating the federal response, had been reorganized after the attacks of 2001 and absorbed into the Department of Homeland Security, a restructuring that many later argued had reduced its capacity and focus for natural disaster response. Its director at the time had limited experience in emergency management, and the coordination between federal, state, and local authorities in the critical first days was characterized by confusion, conflicting information, and an absence of clear command.
So the institutional response failed at exactly the moment when institutional response was the only thing that could reach the scale of the problem.
Yes. And into that void of institutional response came a pattern of public communication that drew intense criticism. In the early days of the crisis, while residents remained trapped on rooftops and in the Superdome without adequate food, water, or medical assistance, some of the most prominent public messaging from authorities emphasized prayer and spiritual reflection, rather than concrete logistical action. New Orleans has a deep and genuine culture of religious life and community faith, and for many residents that faith was indeed a source of sustenance and solidarity during those days. That dimension of the community's response was real, and should not be dismissed. But critics argued that the public emphasis on prayer by authorities responsible for material disaster response functioned as a substitute for action rather than a complement to it. People on rooftops needed boats, not sermons.
So the symbolic register of the official response was misaligned with what the material situation required.
Yes, and that misalignment was not lost on the residents living through it, many of whom experienced it, as evidence of how little those in authority understood or cared about the specifics of their situation. The human geography of the flooding made the social dimensions of the disaster impossible to ignore. The neighborhoods most severely affected by the flooding were disproportionately those with predominantly African American populations and lower median incomes. The lower Ninth Ward, one of the most severely flooded areas, was a predominantly African American working-class neighborhood, where home ownership rates were relatively high, but incomes were modest and evacuation resources were limited. The correlation between the depth of flooding, the demographics of the affected population, and the slowness of the response was documented extensively in the weeks following the disaster, and gave rise to a national conversation about whether race and class shaped not only vulnerability to the disaster, but access to its relief.
So Katrina forced a public confrontation with inequalities that had existed long before the storm arrived.
Yes, the storm did not create those inequalities. It made them visible in a way that television cameras and national media coverage could not look away from. The images from the Superdome and from the convention center, where thousands of residents had gathered seeking shelter and were waiting for evacuation buses that arrived days later than promised, circulated globally and defined the public perception of the disaster. People waiting in extreme heat without water, without functional sanitation, and without clear information about when help would arrive. Elderly residents in wheelchairs, families with infants, people who had done exactly what they were told to do, which was to go to designated shelters, and who had found that the system those shelters implied did not exist in the form they had been promised.
So the shelters themselves became evidence of the failure.
Yes, and the federal government's visible absence during those days had political consequences that were immediate and lasting. President George W. Bush's flyover of the flooded city in Air Force One became one of the defining images of perceived disconnection between the government and the scale of human suffering below. His public praise of the Federal Emergency Management Agency director, telling him that he was doing a great job at a moment when the agency's failures were visible to the entire country, became a defining phrase of the thawing political response to the disaster.
So the political communication of the crisis was as damaging as the operational failures?
Yes, and together they produced a collapse of public trust in federal emergency management that shaped policy debates and political conversations for years. The final death toll from Hurricane Katrina is estimated at approximately 1,800 people, the majority in Louisiana. The number of displaced persons reached into the hundreds of thousands. Many families never returned to New Orleans. Many neighborhoods did not fully recover for years, and some never did.
Though the disaster was not over when the water receded, it continued for years in the lives of those displaced.
Yes, and the economic damage was estimated at over $125 billion, making it one of the costliest disasters in recorded history.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand in depth what happened during Hurricane Katrina and why, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with The Great Deluge by Douglas Brinkley.
So this is a work that goes beyond the headline images and into the lived detail of what the disaster meant.
Precisely. Brinkley draws on extensive research and first-hand accounts to document the experiences of residents, emergency responders, and officials during the crisis, examining how infrastructure failure, poor coordination, and political confusion compounded the scale of the catastrophe. The book also explores how Katrina exposed deep social inequalities and raised profound questions about responsibility, preparedness, and the protection of vulnerable communities during times of disaster.
Is it accessible to a reader who wants both the factual account and the broader analysis?
It is written with clarity and draws the reader through the timeline of the disaster in a way that is both informative and, at times, deeply affecting. Brinkley does not treat the crisis as an abstraction. He grounds it in the experiences of specific people. For a reader who wants to understand not simply what happened, but why it happened and what it means, it remains one of the most thorough and human accounts available.
So reading it gives a reader both the events and the structural conditions that produced them.
Yes, and it leaves the reader with a much clearer understanding of why a disaster of this scale, in one of the wealthiest countries on Earth, unfolded as it did.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of Hurricane Katrina has shaped American policy, political discourse, and public understanding of disaster in ways that are still being worked through. In the immediate aftermath, the post-Katrina natural disasters that had been diminished by the earlier restructuring, the Army Corps of Engineers undertook a $14 billion overhaul of the New Orleans flood protection system, constructing new and substantially stronger levees, surge barriers, and pumping infrastructure designed to withstand a Category 5 storm.
So the investment that had been deferred for decades was finally made, but only after the worst had already occurred.
Exactly. and that pattern of infrastructure investment arriving only after catastrophic failure rather than before it, is one of the most sobering aspects of Katrina's legacy for those who study disaster policy. The investigations that followed the disaster produced a substantial body of documentation about systemic failures. Congressional inquiries, independent commissions, and academic research converged on a set of conclusions about coordination failures, design flaws, and the long accumulation of deferred maintenance and underfunded planning. The investigations also produced explicit findings about the role of racial and economic inequality in shaping both the exposure to the disaster and the quality of the response. These findings moved the conversation about Katrina firmly into the domain of social justice, and not only emergency management.
So the official record itself confirmed what affected communities had been saying from the beginning.
Yes, and that confirmation carried weight, but it came after the fact, and it could not restore the homes, the communities, or the lives that had been lost or permanently altered. The displacement of Katrina survivors became a long-term social phenomenon. The population of New Orleans dropped from approximately 450,000 before the storm to roughly 230,000 in the year following it. The diaspora of New Orleanians across Texas, Georgia, and other states changed the demographics of their destination cities and created communities of displaced people who maintained cultural ties to the city they had left while building lives in places they had not chosen.
So the disaster produced a second, slower human dispersal that had its own consequences for the fabric of both the city and the communities that absorbed its former residents.
Yes, and the recovery of New Orleans has been uneven in ways that have themselves become objects of study and debate. Wealthier and higher elevation neighborhoods recovered more quickly, supported by insurance settlements, access to credit, and the resources to manage the lengthy and bureaucratically complex process of rebuilding. Lower-income neighborhoods, particularly those that had been most severely flooded, faced far longer timelines. Some former residents encountered obstacles in securing rebuilding assistance, navigating property disputes, or returning to neighborhoods where basic services had not been restored.
So, the geography of recovery reproduced the geography of vulnerability.
Yes, the same communities that had been most exposed to the disaster were least equipped to recover from it, and least served by the systems designed to support that recovery. In the broader context of American history, Katrina occupies a position comparable to a small number of other moments, when a specific event stripped away prevailing assumptions and forced a confrontation with conditions that had been present but not fully acknowledged. It demonstrated that poverty in a wealthy country can be as lethal as the storm itself, that the absence of a car in a city whose evacuation plan assumed everyone had one could be the difference between survival and death.
So the disaster made legible something that had always been present, but had not been forced into such direct view.
Yes, and the lessons of Katrina continue to shape how emergency planners, policymakers, and researchers think about the relationship between social inequality and disaster risk. The concept of social vulnerability, the idea that who is most at risk in a disaster is not determined only by geography and meteorology, but by income, race, age, disability, and access to resources, has become a central framework in contemporary disaster studies, partly because of what Katrina made impossible to deny. Today, as climate change increases the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events along the Gulf Coast and in other vulnerable regions, the questions Katrina raised about preparedness, investment, and the equitable distribution of protection have become more urgent, not less. The choice of which communities receive adequate flood protection, which evacuation plans account for those without transportation, and which infrastructure investments are deferred are not technical questions. They are political and moral ones, and Katrina established what the cost of getting them wrong can look like.
So the storm has become a reference point for every subsequent conversation about disaster, inequality, and what governments owe to the people most at risk.
Yes, a city that survived for nearly 3 centuries in a location that should not have permitted it became, in the space of a few days, a measure of what a society is prepared to do for those it has placed in harm's way.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the geography, the failure, and the enduring questions of Hurricane Katrina.
The levees failed because they were not built well enough. But they were not built well enough because certain people were not considered worth the cost of building them better.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.